All right, we should be good to go.
Great, thank you, Molly. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is David Haddad. I'm the president of the AAPG Petroleum Structure and Geomechanics Division. I want to start off by welcoming you all to our annual division meeting. To say that the past year has been challenging would really be an understatement. But I'm really proud of our team because we managed to maintain a tradition that basically spans more than 20 years of annual meetings that the PSGD and its predecessor, the Reservoir Deformation Research Group, and its predecessor, the small technical group that structural geologists and geomechanicists interest folks and within the AAPG have met throughout the years. As with last year, we find ourselves again meeting virtually this year. And while I hope to see everyone in person next year, I do want to point out that today's virtual meeting has attracted a little over 200 unique callers, at least unique registrations, which to me speaks to the wide reach that the PSGD is able to have across the globe because of the virtual option, the virtual meetings that we're having last year and this year. And it's also making us consider, when we resume meeting in person, hopefully starting next year, it's making us consider a hybrid option between a virtual and in-person format where we can basically meet in person, but also have callers calling in virtually and also recording the meeting as we're doing today for later viewing. So to kind of maximize the footprint that the PSGD can have and its accessibility to members of the AAPG and also new members interested in joining the division. So today's meeting is recorded, and I do encourage you to spread the word to your friends and colleagues who can't join us live. But by visiting our YouTube channel and watching a playback of this recording, also watching playbacks of our numerous webinars, the series that we launched this year that I'll talk about here in a little bit. Before I move on, I want to send out a special thank you to the AAPG for supporting the PSGD, and most importantly to all of our volunteers. We really would not be able to do what we're doing today or all what we've done all year and to get to where we are now without them. As you'll see in today's program, the vast majority of our activities are volunteer-led, and this speaks to the dedication that our members have toward seeing the division succeed, seeing the application and dissemination of our science maintain its global reach and maintain its relevancy and its impact, regardless of which, whether you're working in the industry or you're working in the academic sector or in the public sector, or if you're an independent, really our volunteers are there to help advance the sciences of structural geology, geomechanics, and also their applications. So a big shout out, big thank you to all the volunteers who've been helping the PSGD become where it is now, and also helping us maintain momentum. So with that, what I want to do is start off with our agenda. We have a couple of things to cover. Basically, the agenda is divided into two main chunks. The first one is going to cover the business side of the PSGD, kind of what have our activities been since last year's meeting. So there's a couple of items there. What I'll do is I'll start off with the organizational structure to give folks an idea of what the PSGD's structure looks like, what positions are open for volunteers to join and help out, and also passing the baton on from me to the next incoming president and vice president. So you'll get to hear a couple of words from them too. And then what I'll do is I'll cover kind of our membership makeup and its trend over the last few years. We've been tracking kind of how our members have been, how our member numbers, absolute numbers have been increasing and decreasing over the years, but also their general makeup and composition, and kind of show you some interesting phenomena that I think we see as a result of the 2021 PSGD webinar series that we launched back in March this year. And then from there, I'll hand the microphone off to Esti and Jim. What they'll do is walk us through some of the challenges, but also the successes that they've delivered for the 2021, I know here it says it's ACE, but really the name's been changed to IMAGE conference between the AAPG and SEG that happened a few weeks ago. The PSGD has been a sponsor for Theme 4, Structural Tectonics and Geomechanics for the ACE conference and also for IMAGE this year for a number of years. So this is one major effort and contribution that the PSGD has and gives to the AAPG and its membership. So big, huge kudos to ST and Jim for really putting up together an awesome program despite a lot of challenges that they faced between the switch from ACE to IMAGE and repurposing and reorganizing the technical program this year. And then what I'll do is then hand the microphone over to Scott Wilkins. So Scott will walk us through some of the past Best Publication Awards and really a call to get folks together on board to nominate Best Paper Awards or Best Papers for next year. So Scott will spend a few minutes there. And then we'll take a quick 10-minute break for folks to stretch their legs. And then Peter Hennings, Jens-Erik Snee, and Mark Zoback will take charge of the technical session this year, which will be focused on induced seismicity and what we can tell about fault rupture dynamics and their implications for CCS, hydrogen storage, EGS, and other subsurface applications. So we have quite a packed technical session there. For folks who have been calling into PSGD annual meetings or have been joining us in the past, you're probably already familiar with the format of the technical session. It's designed to be really kind of an open mic where the technical leaders, in this case, Jens-Erik, Peter, and Mark, will have seed discussions and conversations, and we encourage participation from the audience. Of course, it's a lot easier when we're meeting in person, and all we can do is it's just a matter of handing the microphone, literally handing the microphone over to someone from the audience to answer a question or to bring forward their thoughts. Virtually, it was a little bit tricky last year, but I think it turned out well in terms of allowing the audience members to bring in questions and then for the technical session coordinators to bring those up and answer those questions and then guide and steer the conversation. So this year, again, with a very hot and relevant topic, I think it'll generate quite a bit of discussion. So with that, the PSGD, it's again, we rely a lot on our volunteers to help out and to assume roles and responsibilities that don't take an insignificant amount of time from their days. This again speaks to the dedication that our members have had to the PSGD and seeing it succeed. So with that, I'm passing the presidency baton on to Ronnie McGinnis. Ronnie was the VP of the PSGD last few years. And so he will become president going forward. And then Molly will be assuming the vice president position there. Really, both Molly and Ronnie have demonstrated enormous dedication to the PSGD and service to the division the last few years, and really, I'm very excited to have them take ownership of the PSGD and its direction going forward. They're going to be bringing in fresh ideas, fresh perspectives, and bringing in a different set of unique network into the division, and hopefully help the division grow and have a broader reach and broader application and relevancy as well. So with that, I know I've asked both Ronnie and Molly to just say a couple of words before I move on. Ronnie unfortunately couldn't join us. He's tied up at work, but he did write up a couple of paragraphs. Maybe Molly, if you'd like to read them, please.
Sure, I would love to. Yeah, he wrote a nice letter, and he says, I'm very sorry I couldn't attend the 2021 PSGD business meeting and technical session. Unfortunately, work got in the way. I think we can all understand that. And he would like to thank everybody who organized the secondly and hopefully final virtual meeting. And I am sure everyone is really looking forward to getting back to some form of normalcy next year and have this meeting in person. The history of the division was based on the desire for fans of structural geology and geomechanics to get together once a year and exchange ideas, successes, and innovations, as well as defeats and areas for improvement over adult beverages face to face. Let's all hope that gets to happen next year. I am grateful to fill the presidency role of PSGD for the next 2 years. I have been lucky enough to serve in several capacities within the division and have watched some great people carry the torch over the years, including friends and mentors, and I hope to continue in the path that they have set. Molly and I will work hard to focus on the core components of the division, including the annual meeting and technical session, the structured tectonics and geomechanics sessions at the annual meetings, the PSGD field trip, and the PSGD monthly webinars, the publication awards, and our various outreach efforts. However, we are also looking forward to finding other ways the PSGD can have an impact or even improve on some of our core initiatives. So please feel free to reach out to either of us over the next year with any comments or suggestions. Lastly, I just want to give a huge thanks to David. He has done an incredible job serving the division over the last 2 years. I am sure no one will ever know what it took to keep things progressing in such a challenging environment, but I hope I can continue to serve the division with the same passion and energy that he did. I will definitely be using his expertise and experiences on the steering committee. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing everyone next year. Best regards, Ronnie McGinnis. It's a great letter, and I'm honored to be vice president and learn from both of you and then see where I can take the division in the next few years.
Thank you, Molly. Those are kind words from you and from Ronnie. And really, it's been an honor for me to serve the division. The last two and a half years have been a very, very good example for me in terms of servant leadership and really the opportunities that I've been exposed to, working with phenomenal people, both within the AAPG staff and also within PSGD volunteers, and also bringing on new members. It's been a huge learning experience for me, extremely rewarding experience too, and really it's thanks to all the folks who have been contributing to the PSGD and from whom I've learned so much. So again, thank you to folks who've supported me the last two and a half years, and I really am excited to see Ronnie and Molly take the baton and advance the division and move us forward and bring in additional successes and exciting ideas. So thank you. So with that, what you're seeing also on the org chart are positions that are identified there in red. And this is really where the division is seeking folks to come in and step up to the plate and help us out with our programs going forward, especially focusing on a couple of key elements there. So as you know, for our annual meeting like today's, the technical sessions are led by folks whom we solicit their expertise and knowledge and time to lead the technical discussions. So with that, we're going to be looking for folks to help us out next year. If you have any ideas on specific technical topics or things that you'd like to highlight or bring to the annual division meeting next year, please bring them forward to me or to Molly or to Ronnie. I think there's an opportunity there for us to start planning the technical session early and develop one that is exciting and is engaging with the members as well. The other big ticket item there is the awards committee. This is a 3-person committee. It's a lot of work that goes into it, too much for one person. And really, Scott is going to be needing an additional, at least 2 more folks to help him out in terms of working through the paper nominations and the paper selection process, and working with the AAPG also on that. So we're looking for additional folks to help Scott out on the awards committee. In terms of external engagement, really we have end open positions there, either engaging with other societies, sister societies, or organizations. So if you have any ideas, if there's an organization that you'd like the PSGD to be plugged into or have a representative within, please let Molly or Ronnie know, and we'll make that happen. On the publications lead, this is focusing on working with the AAPG, their publication team. We have not had a person fill that position in this past year, so we're looking for someone to backfill that role. Again, if you're interested in stepping up to the plate there, please reach out to either Molly or Ronnie. And then finally, with the Young Professionals Committee, we've had several young professionals help out in that space on and off throughout the years. And right now we have basically no one there. So we're looking for folks who are interested in contributing to the Young Professionals Committee, and reaching out to other YP committees within the AAPG and also within sister societies as well. That's always something where the PSGD is trying to focus on and harness the talent of young professionals and bring them up to get them exposed to our network and also get them exposed to our science, and also showcase and highlight the work and contributions that they're doing in whether they're doing it in grad school or if they're doing it in their early years in their careers. So moving on to the membership status and kind of where we stand there. The chart on the left, top left, has been something that we've been tracking for the last couple of years, really kind of going back to the times when we first started recording the number of folks who attend our annual meetings, and also keeping track of who's on our email list, who's active and who's not active there. And so pre-2013, so pre the year of before the formation of the PSGD as a division in 2013, we were known as the Reservoir Deformation Research Group. And so we've had between 100 and 200, 250 members at the time. When the PSGD formed as a division, of course, it gained a lot of attention and had attracted new members both from within the AAPG and from outside the AAPG, and that had caused a bump in our membership numbers, and that kept gradually increasing up until about 2019 actually is when it dropped down a little bit. But then something interesting happened last year. We received quite a big spike of interest in folks wanting to join the PSGD. And so I'll explain why in the next couple of slides, at least my interpretation of why that's the case. And so you can see, of course, the vast majority of our members are either from within the industry or from the academic sector. We have folks joining us also from the public sector, and also a good chunk from the independent or unaffiliated members as well that make make use of the PSGD's expertise. In terms of the breakup there on the chart on the right, again, the industry representation being the highest, and followed by folks, a representation from the academic sector as well. So going back to my point about why I think we saw that increase in the 2020 membership, I have a suspicious feeling that it's because of our monthly webinar that we launched in March this year. This was something that Ronnie, Molly, and I kind of sat down and thought, okay, how can we engage with our membership more than just once a year, which is really during the annual meeting, which is like days like today. And that usually happens during the annual convention and exhibition for AAPG. So we were thinking about ideas of, okay, how do we engage with our membership more often? We're doing it via social media, but with social media, it's kind of a one-way street. And so we wanted to kind of think of ways that we can get folks a bit more excited about some of the topics that the PSGD is interested in. And Ronnie came up with the idea of, hey, like how about we come up with we start up a webinar. And actually, both Ronnie and Molly independently had approached me about this and said, let's think about doing a monthly webinar where we have invited speakers come in and they can talk about any topic of relevance or interest that they're working on. that our membership would find interesting and relevant at the time. And let's record those and make those available on YouTube. So again, with COVID-19 kind of really pushing us to think about outside the box in terms of how can we reach out to our members and engage with them in a virtual world, this has proved to be a huge success. So far, I mean, we started our first webinar. David Farrell, who is a past president of the PSGD, gave a talk on faulting and fracturing in Austin Chalk. And that was hugely popular. I'll show you here in the next slide some statistics on the responses that we received for that first talk. And ever since then, really, we've had a huge level of interest from callers joining the monthly webinar. If you're interested in watching those are all recorded. You know, Molly's done a great job of documenting and keeping track of all of these webinars and hosting the webinars as well. And those are all available on our YouTube channel. So I welcome you all to watch them on there. As with today's meeting, it'll also be on our YouTube channel after we finish recording and do a little bit of editing. So again, I feel like this was a step in the right direction for the PSGD for enhancing engagement with our membership. And so because of that, we've received many new members expressing interest to join the division. And so what I'll show here in our next slide is just some basic statistics on some of the responses that we have had from the first webinar that we had announced, the one that David Farrell had given. What you're seeing in the top left, we've asked registrants to fill out a form to let us know, how did you hear about the webinar? And so I've tried to kind of color code the responses and group them by color. And you'll see here in purple, the left half of that pie chart, the vast majority of folks who have heard about the webinar was on LinkedIn. Either it's via LinkedIn alone, or from LinkedIn and a colleague, or from LinkedIn and an email that we send out, or from LinkedIn and Facebook. So it speaks to it speaks volumes to the footprint that the PSGD has on social media. And really that's taken the lion's share in terms of the attraction of new members to the division. We've had also, interestingly, we've had folks actually spread word on WhatsApp, and I'm a WhatsApp user. I communicate with family and friends internationally, and we've had international interest in the webinars being communicated on WhatsApp, which I found interesting and amusing a little bit. And then of course we have the usual, this word of mouth from colleague to colleague. There's internal dissemination of the announcements from within companies, and also we've had just regular communication by PSGD emails to PSGD members who have their emails in our mailing list. So again, it kind of gives us a good idea of how our reach is impacting, or how our method of communication is impacting our reach out to our members. The pie chart in the bottom left shows that when we asked our those registrants if they'd be interested in joining the PSGD, half of them said yes. So I feel like this is where that big spike in the registrations that in the membership numbers that we have in 2020 comes from the webinars. About a quarter of folks who signed up for the webinars are already members, and then a quarter said they don't want to be, they would not prefer to join the PSGD. And then in the bottom right, I kind of delved into the data a little bit more in the top right, I mean. And what I'm plotting there is, on the x-axis is time since Molly made the announcement about that first webinar, about David Farrell's webinar. And then the y-axis plots the number of folks, individual unique signups for the webinar. And so you can see within the first day or two, we've received the bulk of folks signing up for the webinar. And then about 6 days after the initial announcement, we've had another spike in folks who are interested in signing up. And then Molly sent out a reminder 25 days after the initial announcement, which was about a week before the actual webinar. And so we had another spike in registrations there. And then of course, there's the last minute registrations that happened a day or two before the actual webinar. So it kind of gives us a good idea of what not only where our reach goes, but also in terms of dynamically what that looks like through time. And so it underlines the importance of reminding folks that these webinars are there, and also just making folks aware that these opportunities exist for them to spread word, and also it again helps us engage with our members a lot more dynamically than previously than we've done in the past. Molly, do you have any comments or any kind of insights or any trends that you saw when you were hosting the webinars?
I'm just happy that they were such a success. I think we've had a great list of speakers, and we have more speakers to reach out to in 2022. If you get a chance to go to our YouTube channel, you know, give us some likes and a subscribe. But other than that, we look forward to continuing that for 2022.
Great, thank you, Molly. And again, thanks to you for being an awesome host. I've received lots of great feedback on the way you manage the webinar. So again, I think you know, you've done the majority of the work there in getting folks organized. And of course, you know, the speakers have spent a lot of time and dedication towards sharing their work, sharing whether it was published work or work that's about to be published, and also sharing their insights and conclusions on the topics of interest. So again, a big shout out and thank you to the speakers and volunteers for helping us there. And as Molly said, we are looking for speakers for next year. So if you're interested in signing up for a month, or if you're interested in giving a presentation, please reach out to Molly or Ronnie, and they'll set you up. Okay, and with that, I'd like to hand the microphone off to ST and Jim to walk us through how they've managed through the Image 2021 technical sessions and where the PSGD has made an impact there.
Thank you, David. You can, okay. So hi, my name is Esti Ucar, and together with Jim Granat, I was part of the organizing committee for Theme 4 for this year's Image 2021. As you have probably heard, this was quite a crazy year. So we started gearing up towards a fully in-person meeting. It was going to be ACE 2021 in Denver. And so we asked authors to submit their abstracts, reviewers to review them and score them. We put together a program and everything was going according to plan. And in February or so, we had everything more or less finalized. And then we had to scratch everything off and more or less start from the beginning, except that we already had the abstracts and the scores. So it wasn't from the beginning all the way. But we ended up having a combined meeting. So this was in person and online. And it took place in Denver in September, together with SEG and in conjunction with SAPM. And we expect this to be the format from now on. So we expect to have an Image 2022 and so on. So for Theme 4, we asked authors to submit their abstracts to these general subthemes. We have kept them more or less constant over the years, except that we added a couple of new this year, such as the virtual field studies, videography and drones. And then we had sessions on geomechanics, fractures, modeling, structural styles, salt and conventional reservoirs, and engineering and reservoir completion. So the way this works is that we ask authors to submit their abstracts, and then we ask reviewers to review them. And we select the highest scoring abstracts, and based on those, we combine them into sessions. So next slide, please. So this year we received 108 abstracts, and that's about 11% of the total of all the abstracts that were submitted originally for ACE. So that was 985 submitted abstracts over the 9 themes. And we had a very good turnout of volunteer reviewers. We had 42 in 2021, which is a little bit less than in 2020 and in 2019. but much better than in 2018 and 2017, where we had about half of those. So thanks to so many reviewers, we were able to give an average of 14 reviews to each of the abstract, which is more or less the same as in 2020 and much better than in 2019 and in 2018. Of those, 67.6% of the abstracts scored 4 or higher in a scale of 1 to 6, which is more or less the same as in 2020. And 38% of the abstracts scored 4.5 or higher. So this is where we want to be. And this is a little bit less than in 2020, but it's still pretty good. Now, where the major change came is in the number of abstracts that we were able to accept for the program this year. We were only able to accept 37 abstracts, and of course, it was the highest scoring ones. And this is 34% of the total that were submitted, compared to 69% that we were able to accept in 2020. So this is a lot fewer, and the reason for that is that we had fewer talks per session. So we had 10 sessions allotted to us. They were all oral presentations, no posters. We ended up having to move some people around last minute. We ended up with 6 in-person sessions and 4 online. So this total of 10 sessions is a little bit less than in 2020, less than in 2019, but more or less the same as in 2018 and 2017. Next, please. So here are the sessions that we had in person in Denver. So Monday, we had structural modeling. Tuesday, we had this general session on structural tectonics and geomechanics. And then Wednesday was our full day with 4 sessions: petroleum systems, tectonics and structural styles from lithosphere to thin section, fracturing, unconventional and modeling, salt-involved systems, and another one of these general sessions on structural tectonics and geomechanics. And then at the same time, we had the online sessions going on, and we have to thank the organizing committee, Teresa, who did a great job trying to make sure that none of our theme sessions overlapped, so the ones in person and the ones online. So can you go to the next slide, please? There. So at the same time, at different time slots, I think we only had one of the sessions overlapping with the in-person ones. On Monday, we had fractures from field observations to numerical models. On Tuesday, tectonics and virtual structural visualization and tectonics and salt. And on Wednesday, this final session on structured tectonics and geomechanics. And then new to this year's program, we had a couple of sessions. So these are outside of those 10. So I guess in total, we had 12 sessions really. So this was in combination with theme 6. And this was kind of like a new direction. So it's induced seismicity, research and applications to reservoir development, EOR and carbon capture 1 and 2. So next slide, please. Next year, the plan is to have an in-person meeting in Houston, and the expectation is that it will be, again, this international meeting for applied geosciences and energy 2022. And well, we just want to encourage everybody to submit your abstracts. The more abstracts we get, the more sessions that are assigned to our theme. And just keep in mind that we score the abstract. So it doesn't matter whether you have a really good talk to give. If your abstract is not good, it's not gonna make it into the program. So please submit good abstract and encourage others to do the same. And also please keep volunteering to review abstracts and to co-chair sessions. Without this, we cannot make this happen. And again, the more reviewers we get, the more sessions that are assigned to us. And so for next year, I will continue in the organizing committee. I think Jim had enough and is moving on. So we're looking for at least one other co-chair. So if anybody's interested, please reach out to me. And our jobs as co-chairs will be to communicate closely with the organizing committee, with the reviewers, with the sub-team chairs and the session chairs, and then to come up with innovative ideas for session titles and combinations, and to convince members, of course, to submit abstracts. So thank you.
Thank you, ST. And I want to thank all of the abstract reviewers that we have had review abstracts. You know, as ST pointed out there, you know, north of 14 abstract reviewers per abstract, or reviews per abstract. And every time, you know, we receive feedback from the organizing committee at ACE and Image, you know, they're always impressed by the number of reviews each abstract gets from theme 4. And again, this kind of speaks volumes about the interest and dedication that our membership has towards making sure that the abstracts that are presented, the papers that are presented at ACE and Image are of high quality. And also it shows that we have quite a bit of dedication from and engagement from our members. And so this is, again, by far, this is one of those, on the ACE scorecards, you know, we score really high on, and it's something that we're very proud of. So thank you to all abstract reviewers. And as ST said, you know, the more reviewers we have, the more sessions we can get. And so, and I'll start thinking about signing up as an abstract reviewer for next year's meeting. And of course, it goes without saying, you know, Jim's really led the chairing theme 4 for the last 2 years, and along with ST, you know, they've both done an enormous job to get us to where we are today, especially with all the changes, and some were expected, some were not expected, that have happened this year between in-person meeting in ACE and then the virtual, the transition to it being a virtual hybrid meeting. And ST and Jim have done a lot of acrobatics to get us to where we are, and to actually get theme 4 to be a successful program in the technical sessions. So huge thank you to both Jim and ST for the dedication and commitment this year, and to really, again, keep the involvement and contributions of PSGD into ACE and Image high and relevant, and again, making it possible. So Jim and ST, thank you so much for your service to the theme 4 as co-vice chairs. And as ST mentioned, you know, we're looking for someone else to take the baton from Jim and learn the ropes from ST and help us achieve another successful theme 4 next year. Thank you both, Jim and ST. And Jim, I see your hand raised, so please.
Yeah, if I can just jump in with a couple of comments. Thanks for those kudos, everybody. I'd also like to say that given the circumstances over the whole last year and a half, the people at AAPG have done a Herculean effort to get this program going and keep it on track. They ended up with a meeting that looked very much like the one over the years and about the same size, but you have to remember that it was merged with SEG as well. I had the opportunity to actually go to the meeting and chaired several of the sessions, so I saw firsthand what the results were like. Most of the chaos that came along was with regard to who could be at the meeting and who couldn't be there. So many of the challenges as far as what the contents of the program were whether the authors could get to the meeting or whether they wanted to do it online, and what their employers would let them do. And in the end, that really trailed right up to the beginning of the meeting itself. In fact, one of my co-chairs had his employer pull him from the meeting virtually the day before the session was to happen. So given all that uncertainty, which went right up to the very end, I think AAPG did a great job. The attendance on a lot of the sessions was pretty thin. I think AAPG actually had session chairs do kind of an attendance thing in terms of numbers. And I chaired 3 or 4 of the sessions, and attendance ranged from about 13 people to about 25 people during the talks. And as you can imagine, in these cavernous rooms in the convention center, it seemed thinner than it really was. And there were a few glitches along the way with regard to the mechanics of the program too. If somebody couldn't come at the last minute in person, we actually substituted their recorded session and played it during the in-person session. And there were a couple of hiccups with regard to that. But given all the uncertainties, I think it came off pretty well. If not up to, say, the attendance standards of the last few years, pre-pandemic years. So hopefully down the road, we're gonna get out of that kind of handicap and have more normal sessions. What the meeting is going to look like in the future, the slide on the screen right now, image question mark, is a good indication. With all the talks about mergers going on, we don't really know, us as soldiers in the program don't really know what's going to happen with the program itself down the road, what the meeting's going to look like, if they're going to be separate meetings, if they're going to be joint meetings, and all of those sorts of things are still up in the air. In the end, SEG at the meeting sort of suggested that they might be interested in joining SPE and joining us, so it might become a mega geoscience committee or convention in the future. So who knows? We're up in the air still, and hopefully things will smooth out. But again, thanks for the help that everybody gave. The reviewers were great, and we ended up with the best we could do. With that, I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Jim. We appreciate the insights and summary of all the challenges and all the work that you've done to, again, get us to where we are. So thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so with that, maybe I'll hand the microphone off to Scott. And Scott, I'm happy to advance the slides for you.
Thanks, David. I appreciate it. I guess I'll start off by saying thanks to David and all the rest of the crew to get this going. And I guess today I'll talk about real quickly, because I'd really like to get on to the technical talk, which looks real interesting, about papers and the best paper awards. Last year, I took over this job from Bob Krantz. I kind of feel like Luke failing Obi-Wan a little bit, because right when I took it over, the first round of nominations was actually too slim to do anything with. We only had 2 nominations for the 2021 year for best publications. And if you advance to the next slide, David. So what we're hoping is that 2022 is a lot better. And so this year we have a nomination deadline of March 31st. Hopefully that gives you enough time to ponder what papers you would like to nominate, and simply send a short email to me with the paper name and a little bit of description of why you think the paper and/or papers are worthy. And if you could advance one, David, just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of what papers have won the award in the past. These are a few from the 2020 year, And you could just see by looking at some of these titles that these papers are either really new and interesting papers that are, right on the forefront of technology, or they're seminal publications that, when we're going through grad school, these are the key papers that all of our advisors have given us to read and understand, and are used in many of the common, day-to-day practices. And just from looking through this list, if you advance again, David, you could see that many of these have lots of application to a lot of varying different aspects of structural geology and geomechanics. And a lot of them we take for granted, how much work goes into these papers. I know for sure that publishing a paper is really difficult, and sometimes you wonder, is it worth the time, especially when you're not in academia. And it's a nice way to reward these folks and all their effort that they put forth towards it. And I'll also add that this is an incredible reading list. If you haven't read any of these papers on here, I highly recommend looking back at a few of these when you have some time or make some time. They really form the foundation of our science. And so with that, I think I'll just say, reiterate that last year we received a grand total of 2 nominations. And so this year we really hope to do a lot better than that. I know that, yes, COVID changed society, but we all still read papers, perhaps even more than typical, or at least I hope we all still reading these papers. And like I said, there's a monumental effort that goes into these. So let's reward some of the people that put forth this effort. We're seeking nominations for a seminal publication as well as a recent one. And it doesn't necessarily have to be AAPG. It could be any other journal. Just send me along an email, and we'll get the ball rolling for 2022. So with that, I think I'll hand it back off to David.
Thank you, Scott. And what we'll do, we'll send out the announcement for the nominations after today, and we'll make that announcement also on LinkedIn, just to remind folks some of the criteria that we're looking for and the award categories that Scott will be looking for too. And also a reminder that we're looking for 2 additional folks to help Scott out with the nominations and selection process. So if you're up for it, please reach out to Scott or Molly or Ronnie or me, and we're happy to get you set up there. Thank you, Scott.
Sure. No problem.
So with that, we have 2 more slides before we take a quick 10-minute break. So the first one is, as you know, if you've been part of the PSGD for a while now, we like to run an annual field trip. And this year, our trip is going to be on December 4th at Canyon Lake Gorge. It'll be led by past PSGD past president David Farrell. This has been a hugely popular trip in the past. David has run this trip, I don't know how many times, and I've been on it, at least 2 or 3 times, both within PSGD and also from other avenues as well. It's a hugely popular trip. We have folks from different backgrounds join the trip, and the feedback that we get is always positive. If you're interested in signing up, there's still spots available. Please reach out to me, and I'm happy to get you signed up and send you information about the trip and kind of where to meet and some of the logistical details there. But again, this trip it usually sells out pretty fast, just because it's so accessible and so popular. And if you've been with it on any field trips led by David and his team, they run a awesome field trips, and so there's a lot to learn there. And of course, the conversations are always great on the rocks. So let me know if you're interested in this year's trip. And for next year's trip, it's still in planning phase, but I'm going to hand the microphone to Peter Hennings to give us a quick preview of next year's annual field trip.
Yep, thanks, David. Can you hear me? So following on the theme of making these field trips accessible, which means for many of us, Texas is convenient, certainly, we propose to spend really 2 days visiting the Llano uplift country of Central Texas. The Llano uplift exposes the Proterozoic basement and the Paleozoic section around its margins, where we can visit fractured basement, we can visit extensionally faulted Paleozoic strata, and really appreciate a window into the Precambrian and Paleozoic geology of Texas. And I think the Llano country is underappreciated in terms of what it has to offer geologically. It's beautiful scenery, great food, and some good outcrops. And so that's our proposal. It would be a Saturday to a Sunday, maybe. David, we'll have to get these things sorted out, with the possibility to have an overnight at a nice conference center. We'll have chances for discussions. Maybe we can get Tom Ewing to regale us with his Geology of Texas presentations, which are really tremendous, and remind ourselves about the spectacular geology in Central Texas. That's it.
Thank you, Peter. And again, we're still in planning phase, but if you're interested in at least expressing interest in this trip, please reach out to me. And I think there's both Peter and Thomas have done a lot of work in terms of building the motivation behind this field trip, and it's definitely of interest and relevance to us, and we're looking forward to seeing how it shapes out. Thank you, Peter. Okay, so with that, this concludes the business section of our meeting. What I'd like to do is, I know we're about 3 minutes behind schedule, so what I'd like to do is maybe take a 7-minute break or so, stretch your legs, and we'll reconvene, and we'll have Peter, Jens, and Mark take over the technical session and present some of their work, and also start the discussion with our audience. Okay, so with that, we'll reconvene in another 7 minutes. Thank you. Well, thank you, Paul, for pointing out that I was muted there. I was talking to myself for a good minute too. Thank you all for joining us again. Just wanted to ask Jens or Peter or Mark if you'd like to drive the technical session, or if you'd like me to advance my slides. I'm happy either way. But for the next hour or so, we're going to delve into the technical session of the meeting.
So I think, David, this is Peter, we'll each drive our own slides. I think Jens is going to go first. Jens, do you want to say a few words about the overall premise of this session?
Sure. I can't turn on my video yet. It says that it's blocked, but I can just start right now and say a few things and let me know if you can't hear me very well. And David, jump in if I miss something. I think that the purpose of this session is, well, first of all, I think to create a room for discussion amongst all of you in the audience. And so Peter, Mark, and I will be introducing some sort of fundamental concepts, as well as the results of several studies that we and others have done in largely oil and gas producing areas to understand the causes and ways to mitigate induced seismicity, with an eye towards applying that towards carbon capture and storage, geothermal development, hydrogen storage, and so on. Basically, I think each of the three of us will build off of one another, and I'll start with some more fundamental concepts first.
Sorry, Jens, just I'm trying to figure out here. I think I may have to make you a co-host to share your screen.
Sounds good.
Okay, here you go.
Great. Let me actually share it. Okay, stop me if anybody can't see that, and hopefully you can see everything here. So, right, as I just mentioned, I'm going to introduce some of the fundamental sorts of concepts. I'll move pretty quickly through it, probably missing most of the details on all of this, but the hope is that we can discuss this in more detail afterwards as a group. And I'm going to focus in particular on how geomechanical principles, and specifically understanding the stress field, can be applied to understanding and mitigating induced seismic hazards, and with taking learnings from oil and gas development areas and applying them to other types of energy development and carbon storage. So first, though, I would like to back up and address sort of an overall question of why this matters in a say geothermal or carbon capture and storage context. In most cases, the earthquakes that have been triggered by these types of industrial processes have been fairly minor. So generally causing very minor damage, with a few exceptions when we're talking about geothermal energy and carbon capture and storage. But that doesn't mean that they're insignificant, and that doesn't mean that the potential doesn't exist for larger events. And I think a good example of the hazards here for geothermal development in particular, but all types of involvement with changing fluid pressures in the subsurface, is encapsulated well by the example from Basel, Switzerland, where an enhanced geothermal development operation came to a very unfortunate, very early end after only about 6.5 days of stimulation. So this was back in 2006. They began injecting into the wellbore here, and you can see the wellhead pressure as it ramped up over the course of a few days from the wellhead on the order of 0 megapascals to about 30, so a substantial increase in fluid pressure. They're stimulating between 4 and 5 kilometers depth. And you can see seismicity ramping up at the same time. They realized they had a problem partway through this. They shut the well in, and then they had a magnitude about 3.5 earthquake that resulted in the indefinite and then eventually permanent closure of this operation only a few days into its development. The European examples can sometimes seem a little extreme in terms of caution relative to the American cases and what American populations often are willing to accept. But I'll note that even in cases like Oklahoma, where the public tends to be more in support of oil and gas development and more willing to tolerate issues like induced seismicity, there was still increasing concern as the magnitude 4 and in a few cases 5+ earthquakes were occurring there in the mid-2010s. And in this case, the operator, actually the lead of the project, was tried for criminal charges, and he was acquitted, but he was facing, if convicted, jail time, among other things. So, to underscore why this matters as we move to scale with these processes. So now I'd like to step in a different direction and establish a few principles for understanding the stress field and how we map it. And for many people, this will be familiar. We have several techniques available to us for measuring both the orientations and relative magnitudes of the 3 principal stresses. And so here on the left, we're looking at 2 unwrapped image logs of a subvertical borehole. And there you can see these thin fractures represent drilling-induced tensile fractures that can occur in some wells. And just so happens that there were also borehole breakouts in the same well here. These are the broader zones. And the drilling-induced tensile fractures occur characteristically on the sides of the wellbore wall opposite one another that are parallel to SH max, the maximum horizontal principal stress. Breakouts are 90 degrees away. So, we using established quality criteria, if we have enough of these indicators over enough range of the well, consistent enough in their orientations, we can determine an orientation of SH max for that area. And this is widely used in the industry. Another established and tried and true technique is the use of earthquake focal mechanisms, or beach balls, shown here on the right. This is from a new textbook by Mark and Argencoli. And what they're showing is earthquake beach balls for the various different types of faulting that can occur. And if enough of those occur in a localized area, they can be inverted to determine the best fitting stress field that would have caused all of those events. And so that provides both the orientation of SH max and also, importantly, the relative magnitude. So whether the vertical stress, maximum horizontal stress, or minimum horizontal stress are large in relation to the others. And there are several other techniques. I'll just mention one more that's become possible and potentially widely used with the advent of multi-stage hydraulic fracturing, particularly in horizontal wells. So this is a depiction of 4 horizontal well bores. The middle one here is being stimulated in stages. And these dots represent micro earthquakes that occurred colored by the stage. And they trace out the orientation, in many cases, including this case, of the hydraulic fracture, which propagates in the direction of SH max. And so with enough of those averaged together, you might obtain a reliable SH max orientation. Okay, with those sort of principles established for some of the ways that you can measure the stress field, I want to show some of the results of doing that at scale. And here we're looking at a new map of the state of stress in North America. We're calling it a new generation map that Mark and I developed as part of my recent PhD work. And each of these black lines represents the orientation of SH max at that point as measured in usually a wellbore, but sometimes in a microseismic monitoring operation or from earthquake focal mechanisms. And it points in the direction of SH max at that particular point. I'll note that each of these measurements can be, in most cases, safely assumed to represent a large vertical distance in the crust with the occurrence of additional, or the availability of additional data at additional depths in the same areas. We overwhelmingly see very consistent SH max orientations regardless of depth. And you can also see a lot of coherency and consistency depending on where you are. So nearby measurements tend to be fairly similar in their orientation. See that in the eastern part of the continent, this gradual clockwise rotation westward. And then if we get over to the western part of the continent, say in the western US, there's a lot more variability at finer scales. But even where it looks incoherent at this scale, if you were to zoom in, you can see coherency at finer scales, such as the Permian Basin in this example. And you may be wondering what the background grid is, the colorful grid there, and that represents the style of faulting. So we're able to show basically all parts of the stress tensor, at least in a relative sense. So the colored grid is a depiction, or it's a coloring of what's called the AFE parameter. It came from Bob Simpson in the mid-90s. And it is a single number ranging from 0, which is the most extensional case, to 3, which is the most compressive case, that describes the ratio of the 3 principal stress magnitudes, since a simple ratio between 3 things is not possible. So this is a way to make that possible and simple. And so I'm showing on the right this schematic here of various different types of faulting and the corresponding AFE values from the most extensional case of radial normal faulting on the top left, which in AFE is 0, which is quite rare in practice. I see someone cannot see my screen, so stop me if that's the case for anybody else. As the style of faulting becomes more compressive, AFE increases correspondingly. So this is the Andersonian case of normal faulting that one expects, with a conjugate set of normal faults with strikes parallel to SH max. That occurs when the vertical stress is the maximum principal stress. You can have a more compressive state where both normal and strike slip faults are active in the same area, potentially at the same times, which is not necessarily an indication of a complex stress field, but instead just that the vertical stress magnitude is comparable to SH max in magnitude. That would be an AFE of 1.0 plus or minus, and then increasing from there through strike slip faulting, strike slip reverse, and so on, up to the rare case of radial compression, which is AFE of 3. And then we can look back at the map and see in the eastern part of the continent, more compressive styles of faulting, mostly reverse faulting, the transition westward to less and less compressive, going through strike slip reverse in orange. Green is pure strike slip that extends out into Oklahoma. Teal is strike slip and normal faulting in much of the western US, with a few areas of pure normal faulting. Okay, so using this type of information, we have a few powerful applications at our disposal. Just one note that I've been talking about relative stress magnitudes, but there are ways using a few assumptions to estimate what the absolute magnitudes of the principal stresses are. And really you can estimate what the bounds or the permissible values of the principal stresses are. And this is a graphical way of showing that, how the stress magnitudes change as a function of increasing AFE or increasing compressiveness of the stress field. And so in normal faulting, as I mentioned, the vertical stress is the maximum principal stress. But as the stress field becomes more and more compressive, you see SH max and SH min increase characteristically all the way up to the case of the most compressive style of faulting. And so if the vertical stress SV is known, here everything is normalized to the vertical stress, and it's not difficult to measure that or to assume it within reasonable bounds. And if the pore pressure is known within reasonable bounds, you can estimate, you can at least estimate the values of SH max and SH min in absolute sense. Okay, another thing we can do is understand the potential of existing faults that are known in the existing stress field to fail as a result of some change in pore pressure on them, or how much pore pressure would have been needed to make an earthquake occur that we observe in an area if we know, say, we have an earthquake focal mechanism and we know what the orientation of that fault was. And this is a graphical depiction of that, a Moore circle, for showing how that can be done. For those who don't know about these or really don't want to know about these, you don't really need to know much other than that this is a plot of the shear stress, so the stress parallel to a plane, relative to the normal stress, so the stress perpendicular to, in this case, a fault plane, so the stress clamping that fault shut, for any orientation of fault that's possible. Those are represented by these random dots here. And so you can see that in most cases, within the known stress field. So in this case, we have a roughly strike slip normal faulting stress state, a little more strike slip faulting because SH max is greater than SV. And most of these faults are considered to be inactive. But the closer you get to this failure line here, this is the more coolant failure envelope, the more likely it is that those faults become active. And this one shown right here is at the failure line, so thought to be critically stressed. If the pore pressure increases, you can think of the Moore circle moving to the left or the failure line moving to the right. And more orientations of faults will become potentially active in the stress field. And if you end up with an earthquake of a known orientation and a known stress field, you can estimate the pore pressure that would have been needed for that fault to slip, and you can determine how well oriented that fault was. And so we've done this in a few cases, and I think Mark and Peter will talk about this in a much more aggregate view. But we've looked at this in Texas for some well-known earthquakes suspected to be induced. And so I'll start with the case of Azle near Fort Worth. And here we have a Moore circle. The orientations of the two faults that were involved with these earthquakes were known. There was a sort of a conjugate set of normal faults. And you can see, knowing the stress field there, strike slip normal faulting stress field in this area, that these two planes were almost perfectly oriented. So it would have required very little pore pressure change to trigger slip here. This is an area where wastewater disposal is happening, and that is a suspected cause. We tend to see something similar, maybe not quite as perfectly oriented, but quite similar in other areas when we look at those earthquakes. There's several focal mechanisms in the Snyder area, Cogdell oil field, where we see that at least one of the focal mechanism, or I'm sorry, at least one of the nodal planes in each of the beach balls is fairly well oriented for failure with only a few megapascals of increase needed. And this is, especially the case when you consider that there's a fair amount of uncertainty in SH max orientations in this area, but we still see that faults are pretty well oriented. Along the Gulf Coast, it's a different tectonic setting. Here, there's growth faults active, as the sediments extend into the Gulf of Mexico, they tend to be at a shallower angle. And so, even so, we see that the nodal planes in that area, for those earthquakes, there's another area where the earthquakes are suspected to have been triggered. In those cases, it would have required only small pore pressure magnitudes or modest pore pressure magnitudes to make those slip. And especially since these are sediments in more clay-rich lithologies, you could imagine that the coefficient of friction might be a little lower in this particular area, which might make it a little easier, in fact, for these faults to fail. And I want to mention,
sorry to interrupt. I just looking at the time, just keeping an eye on the time check. Just
sure.
Want to see. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll wrap up quickly. I'm almost done, actually. The case of Timpson, it was thought to be an exception for a while because the fault was thought to be oriented almost perpendicular to the stresses we determined. But if a group led by Kaiwen Wang and others at Stanford relocated those earthquakes and found that actually, if you relocate those, it forms two trends that are much better aligned for failure than we would have thought originally. This applies at a grander scale as well, that if you look at the cases of Oklahoma, Martin Schoenball and others took the event locations there, relocated those, obtained plane orientations. We know the stress field from the new mapping, and they showed that the vast majority of planes are oriented the way you would expect them under Moore Coulomb failure theory. So this allows us to a number of tools and potential for managing induced seismic hazard and understanding of what the hazard might be. And I want to just quickly mention the fault slip potential tool developed by the SCITS group at Stanford. And what it does is it takes what is known about the stress field, faults, pore pressure, and any pore pressure change, and you can include information, detailed information on the orientations of faults with small segments and so on, and estimate the potential that those faults might fail. So it has both a probabilistic mode and a deterministic mode. The deterministic mode will tell you, knowing what we know, what's the pore pressure change that would cause that fault to fail. The probabilistic mode takes all the uncertainties we know about all of those geomechanical factors I mentioned. And if you give it a pore pressure change, say you think that injection will cause that small increase in pore pressure, like what we see here, this is for about 300 PSI, this is the probability that fault will become critically stressed. You can see some faults are more concerning than others. So this is my last slide, and I just want to mention a new direction that, that may be available as a result of knowing both the SH max orientations and relative magnitudes. Throughout the continent, probabilistic seismic hazard analysis has been done historically with pretty limited constraints on the physics. And so there's a group of people, mostly at University of Maryland and a few people at the USGS, who are toying with the idea of using the information of the stress state to make some constraints. So this is a fictional example of the Mears Fault in Southwest Oklahoma. Here we're using FSP not for its intended purpose, but to evaluate some different scenarios. And you can see the change here in relative to a baseline of what knowing which segments of the fault might be most likely to slip would do in terms of the predicted peak ground acceleration, or this, in this case, the spectral acceleration at points of interest. Okay, thanks.
All right. Hopefully you can hear me and see my screen, and somebody can tell me if not. Well, I'm just going to amplify really some of the things that Jens has already introduced. And my message is consistent, and that is how surprisingly easy it is to cause geologically dead or dormant faults to rupture, reactivate. And of course, the discussion we want to have is application of that for really this purpose and other purposes like CCS and gas storage and so on. So my slides will advance. Here's a kind of a new area. Jens mentioned Snyder, but this is the Midland Basin. If you can see my cursor, here's a little inset map where a number of earthquake sequences have occurred in the last 3 or 4 years. In this graph below, the red line represents the number of earthquakes of 2.5 and higher per month. And so you can see that this area has become alive like other areas such as the Fort Worth Basin and Oklahoma. A nice thing in this particular system, which is subject to the primary causal agent of inducement being saltwater disposal in shallow strata in the amber color and in deep strata in blue, is we have faults of many different orientations present in this system. And the map on the right shows one of these FSP analyses. This is run in deterministic mode, where the faults that have been interpreted, if they have the warmer colors, those have the higher FSP. And of course, you can see how those follow the earthquake sequences. The dark earthquakes are ones that have been relocated using hypo-DD. So the point here, this is very simple system in the Midland Basin, shows us what's expected. The faults that are critically stressed are the ones that are reactivating. And we can look at this population and do more analysis to ask the question, what really forms that threshold for the fault reactivating? Another example is some work we've done in TextNet and Scissor over the years in the Fort Worth Basin. And here's the inset map of the Fort Worth Basin, where injection from 2005 through 2012 into the Ellenberger that sits above basement caused reactivation of existing faults. And you can see the monthly injection in the squiggly line and then the different colored earthquake sequences that occurred over that time. Our work in the Fort Worth Basin resulted in the development of a very comprehensive geological description and an evolutionary pore pressure model, which is shown here on the right, with the pore pressures being higher over time in the warm colors, and all of these faults and earthquake sequences responding basically how they should. And so here's just a little bit of detail from some of that work in 2 areas. Here's this Venus area. And in the Venus area, you can see how the pore pressures change through time. This is in megapascals. And then when various earthquake sequences came alive, and this pore pressure increase achieved a plateau when local saltwater disposal operators, in the face of these earthquakes, curtailed their disposal. Also in this plot, we see how the FSP evolves over time and some other parameters. So Venus is acting as expected. Jens has already talked about this Azle example. It's also acting as expected, only here we can now see how the pore pressure changed really quite comprehensively, causing inducement of these anesthetic faults to move. And then finally, there are also cases in the Fort Worth Basin, like there are in northern Oklahoma and Kansas, with inducement at a distance, where some of the earthquake sequences, notably in Irving, Dallas, were triggered with very tiny increases in pore pressure. So this work is all out and published. And so summarizing that are the points that are most interesting to me. That faults in this basin formed in Proterozoic time, and then they were reactivated in Pennsylvanian time as normal faults, and then they lay kinematically dormant for 300 million years until they were reactivated by minor increases in pore pressure. Increases between practically nil to about 0.36 MPa. Earthquake sequences near the sites of injection initiated first, and then the more distant sequences became active later and at lower pore pressure increases. What this indicates is that as the pressures grew, it was the most sensitive faults that were perturbed. We've learned something about the FSP threshold for this system, but I think also interesting is that the slip potential of the faults that became seismogenic is similar to those that didn't rupture, indicating that there are inherent differences in the sensitivity of the faults within this complex pattern of rupture. So those two cases really are cases of simplicity, Midland and Fort Worth Basin. The Delaware Basin, as if some of you have been following, is a case of pretty strong complexity. And Mark will address this more mechanistically when he follows. In the Delaware Basin, it's convenient to divide the earthquakes into a southern area and a northern area. And these are the earthquake histories in those two different areas. In the south, you can see that the earthquakes reached a plateau in 2018 and 19, and the monthly rate has been subsiding since. And there's a magnitude ceiling of about 3.5 in this area in the south. In the north, in this thing we call CMES, Culbertson-Mentone Earthquake Zone, the monthly earthquake rate is really just going through the roof now, and the magnitude ceiling is considerably higher. And the reason is those two systems are very different. Most of the earthquakes in this northern area, in this rectangle, are occurring in the basement. And most of the earthquakes in the south are occurring up in the sediments in the Wolfcamp shales and the Delaware Mountain Group above. Two very distinct earthquake systems. So it looks like in the north, the earthquakes in CMES are being triggered by deep injection into strata underneath the shales and above basement. And in the south, the earthquakes are being induced by a combination of injection in the Delaware Mountain Group, that's shallow injection, and also a pretty complicated pattern of hydraulic fracturing inducement as well. So we have these distinctly different systems, basement rooted and shallow. And the interesting thing about I'm just going to skip this slide. Interesting thing about the shallow earthquakes, if you can see my cursor, is they're being hosted along faults that are bounded in the stratigraphy in the Delaware Mountain Group, faults that extend up into Ochoan units, perhaps down into the shales below. But these shallow faults hosting the earthquakes in the south are geologically detached from the basement faults. And so these systems have these two different sort of physical mechanisms at play, with basement rooted faults really being more stable as a system and the shallow normal faults being more unstable geologically. So this is borrowing work from Mark that I think he'll talk about in a minute from the Zoback and Gorlick 2012. What we see is that these two different fault systems in the Delaware Basin really occur in different mechanical circumstances. The shallow faults are rupturing in weaker rocks that are bed bounded. They have a lower magnitude ceiling, and their slip is probably constrained because of that. And the more basement rooted faults show higher magnitudes and moments, and that's because they're cutting stronger rocks and larger fault surfaces. And then my final slide is something I think is just fascinating as a structural geologist, is we see these faults at the surface, these faults that are now neotectonically active. In the south, we see this evidence of faulting and other things in this INSAR ground surface displacement map, where negative is subsidence and black, and positive is uplift or white. You know, there's evidence of groundwater mining for fracturing and other influences here, but this linear pattern in the south is the reflection of those bed-bounded faults whose displacement is propagating to the surface to the point that we can see surface deflections. And then even more interesting to me anyway, is that recent faulting in CMES, it's basement rooted. This basement rooted faulting has now made its expression known at the surface. So we have these previously dormant faults, deep and shallow, in different systems that are coming to life now. So I've really covered these points, so I'm not going to go over it now. I'm going to switch over and let Mark finish us up, and then we can have discussion.
Well, thank you, Jens, and thank you, Peter. That's an excellent introduction to what I want to talk about. And my comments today are going to be really focused on CCS. I think Jens and Peter have discussed saltwater injection related issues very well and laid a good foundation for this discussion. The discussion of triggered faulting and CCS, I'd like to think Steve Gorelick and I started the conversation a decade ago. It's a conversation that had quite a bit of response, as some of you may know, because I felt very strongly that it was being totally overlooked by the CCS community. The argument was, well, if we don't inject it higher than the frac gradient, there was nothing to worry about. Well, you know, it's a lot easier to trigger earthquakes on critically stressed faults than it is to hydraulically fracture the rock. The pressures Peter was just quoting, for example, the pressures that Jens and I determined for the cases he talked about were all below the frac gradient. So we, in this paper, we argued that there is a high probability that earthquakes will be triggered by injection of large volumes of CO2 into the brittle rocks commonly found in continental interiors. Because even the small moderate earthquakes threaten the seal integrity of CO2 repositories, in this context, large-scale CCS is a risky and likely unsuccessful strategy for significantly reducing greenhouse gas emissions. From a technical point of view, I'd change nothing in this paper, but there are a few things that are of note. One is that public opinion may be more important than seal integrity. And we know from many cases around the world that felt earthquakes are of tremendous concern to the public. And it could well be that if CCS is considered a hazardous endeavor by the public, it will lose support and therefore not happen. The other thing that's become clear is that while CCS is not desirable, it's expensive and it's difficult. In the last decade, it's become clear that it's going to be necessary. It's going to be necessary at a very large scale in the decades to come. The IEA has said that we need to, sequester 6 gigatons of CO2 per year by 2050 if we're going to reach global decarbonization goals. 6 gigatons of CO2 is a volume of fluid that's 1.5 times the size of the current global oil industry. In the near term, CCS is expected to reach 1 gigaton. Well, today, we're injecting about 20 million tons of anthropogenic CO2. So we have to increase by 50-fold in less than a decade. In fact, if every CCS project that's now being considered, either operational, pilot tests, or even any degree of planning goes forward, CCS will only increase by about 175 million tons per year by the end of the decade, well short of the gigaton goal. It's going to take $1 trillion to fund all this. But as you know, the global focus on climate and the global commitment to net zero and decarbonization by mid-century is making clear reaching net zero will be virtually impossible without CCUS. This is, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but these resources are available if you're interested. This is from the Global CCS Institute. It's tracking everything that's happening in red, everything that's planned in blue, and the different industrial sectors that are represented in the different rows, and points out that if all of this happens, every one of these projects are carried out as intended, will be well short of the goals set forth. Now, if you followed CCS over the past 15 years or so, you know, it really came on the scene around 2005. Tracking saline aquifers from a volumetric perspective indicates that there's, at least in theory, enormous pore space available. This is from the 2008 DOE Atlas. The more recent atlases are principally the same. The volumes of theoretically storable CO2 in saline aquifers is incomprehensibly large and more than meets our needs. But the problem is these volumetric estimates are really not very helpful. And they're not helpful because there's not been any kind of characterization, either geologically or hydrologically. And in fact, 0.002% of saline aquifers have been assessed to date. And as you go through these assessments, obviously the estimates that can be stored are greatly reduced. So there's a tremendous need for the earth science community to carry out geologic characterizations, for the engineering and hydrologic communities to carry out hydrologic characterizations. Teletsky has argued that he's recently retired from Exxon. These estimates are at least a factor of 10 too high. Some estimates say they're more than 20 times too high. And we need a geomechanical characterization as well to find out what pressure changes are likely to do in the subsurface. Now, in the last decade, we've learned a lot about this. Everyone's familiar with what's happened in north central Oklahoma with the water produced from the Mississippi line and related water-bearing formations being injected down into the Arbuckle Formation. The pressure spread out, the pressure penetrates critically stressed faults at depth, and a tremendous amount of seismicity has occurred. The modeling that is in the Lund, Weingarten, and Zoback paper of 2018 says that basically the pressure changes at depth are really very small, about, you know, at most 0.2 of a megapascal, but correlates exactly with the earthquakes. So the only heterogeneity in this model is that the Nemaha fault is a sealing fault. It's an old dead fault, but otherwise this is a homogeneous model. And so you see the earthquakes are where the pressure changed. If you actually look at the pressure change in the Arbuckle, it's less than a megapascal, kind of like what Peter was describing for the Ellenberger. So the real question is whether basal aquifers are really targets for sequestration at all, unless they have some sort of bottom seal. If the pressure penetrates the basement rocks, things like this are going to happen. It's really something of concern. The Mount Simon sandstone is of the Illinois Basin is been recognized for a long time as a candidate site for large-scale sequestration. This is a very nice paper from the Lawrence Berkeley group. They looked at multiple models. They had good data as these things go to constrain the model parameters. They looked at a variety of scenarios all around the idea that 100 million tons a year would be injected in 20 wells that are spread out as shown. The modeling shows what all of these types of models show, and that is that the footprint for the CO2 plume is very small. This is a few kilometers across. But the pressure impact of this injection is enormous. What we see, these are bars, so this is 3 megapascals in an area about 200 kilometers by 150 kilometers in scale, sitting directly on the crystalline basement. Now, to be concerned about this, as Steve Gorelick and I expressed in our 2012 paper, is not without some experimental justification. And that's the Decatur, Illinois injection project. A relatively small amount of CO2 is being injected into the Mount Simon. The earthquakes are occurring on faults, penetrating down into the basement. None of these earthquakes have been very large, but they are occurring due to a small pressure change of less than a megapascal. Now, what they've done in response to this is they've moved the injection zone up, and there are some what they refer to as mudstone baffles. They're not good seals, but they do inhibit the transmission of pressure to the basement. And so they are somewhat effective, but it should be pointed out that the earthquakes are still occurring. They're still occurring in the same place. There are just fewer of them, and the magnitudes remain small. So, you know, it's really, I think, an issue of great concern. This project is happening directly within the town of Decatur, and the operator of the plant there has said that as soon as one earthquake is felt, basically the project is shut down. That's his statement. Now, let's look at something else we know from saltwater injection-induced seismicity, and to follow up some of the comments of Jens and Peter on the Delaware Basin. And I want to focus on this southern part of the basin that Peter talked about, the shallow earthquakes that are occurring in the Delaware Mountain Group and the Bone Spring in response to saltwater disposal in the Delaware Mountain Group. Now, the really interesting thing here is when you look at where there has been production from the Delaware Mountain Group and the Bone Spring, that's the Delaware Mountain Group earthquake, Delaware Mountain production wells are shown in purple. What you can see is the earthquakes are occurring where production has not previously occurred. In other words, in the area where the earthquakes are occurring, the Delaware Mountain Group is a saline aquifer. There are no hydrocarbons there. Their hydrocarbons are limited to the area to the north. Where the hydrocarbons have been produced, there are no earthquakes. Where the injection is occurring into a saline aquifer, there are earthquakes. And the injection, of course, occurs across the entire area, as shown here. So now you see the location of the injection wells. The injection wells in the Reeves County area, the southern area, is inducing seismicity. Basically, the earthquakes, the wells that are further north in the basin are not inducing seismicity. The G et al. Paper that Peter referred to, looking at the pore pressure changes in this area, are showing that these earthquakes are occurring in response to small pressure changes, less than 20 PSI, in much of Reeves County, 100 PSI in some areas, and a few hundred PSI in specific locations. But in general, this saline aquifer is being, induced seismicity is occurring. The faults are oriented exactly as aligned with the stress field. The magnitudes of the stress are consistent with frictional faulting equilibrium. This is all shown in the DeVory and Zoback paper that's referenced here. And so it's, triggering slip is not expected. But where there has been prior production, there is no seismicity. And that's because the depletion has lowered the pore pressure and moved the state of stress away from the critical faulting line. So this is a plot that we sometimes call the DARS plot. Anyway, it's the minimum stress and the pore pressure. We've normalized it because we're combining data from wells at different depth. We've normalized it by the vertical stress. The diagonal line here is frictional equilibrium, but our point is in Reeves County, the pore pressure is more or less hydrostatic. It was not perturbed by production, but where you look at the area where production has occurred up here in these 3 wells for which we have data near the Texas-New Mexico border, they've been on a stress path. That means that we moved away from the normal faulting line. So the depletion has prevented a small pore pressure increase from inducing seismicity. So in most cases, depleted oil and gas reservoirs should be useful for carbon storage. The reservoirs still require geomechanical due diligence, but you're starting off with a situation that's probably a lot more stable than in an unperturbed saline aquifer if it's a relatively brittle rock. Now, the weak sands of the Gulf of Mexico are an attractive target. They're not in frictional equilibrium, not likely to produce earthquakes, but still, and also because of the oil development, many of the saline aquifers are already relatively well characterized. So there's going to be a lot happening in the Gulf of Mexico, and for very good reason. I think it's just a geologic domain in which you're really starting without a lot of the issues that are going to be challenging in other intraplate areas. But production has affected these depleted oil and gas reservoirs. And so there is, again, still this need for geomechanical site characterization. I've talked about this in a recent SAG honorary lecture with the geomechanical issues affecting long-term storage of CO2, both the earthquake issues and other issues. And this will be repeated, this honorary lecture will be repeated on November 4th if anyone's interested. So I'm happy to stop there and open things up to the group. And I think the 3 of us are available to answer questions. If there are any.
Thank you, everybody.
Go ahead, Molly.
I was going to say thank you. If you'd like, you can type some of your questions into the Q&A box, and then the authors can read from there. They can also type an answer or answer live, and we may copy some of the questions that came through over there just to kind of keep them from getting lost in the chat.
So thanks, Molly. Yeah, just a reminder for folks, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. But I've managed to dig through the chat box, and there's a couple of questions that have come up. The first one is, so the stress map that Jens had showed is onshore. So how about mapping stress in the offshore, like in the GOM?
I may defer to Mark. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Mark.
We've tried. The problem is, in places like the Gulf of Mexico, the wells are essentially almost always deviated. And when they're deviated, the pipe rubbing on either the top of the well when you're drilling or the bottom of the well when you're tripping leads to key seats that makes detection of breakouts essentially impossible in the data sets that have been made available to us in which we've tried to do this. It's a great idea. In principle, it could work, but there are some just operational and geologic issues that make it very challenging to employ the kinds of techniques that Jens talked about that work well in other areas.
And I'll add the issue of salt there too. I don't think, yeah, with all the salt domes, you end up with the stresses varying on scales that are pretty local there.
Thank you, guys. Another question from Jim Evans. The Zoback and Goro Lake paper was likely on point. However, most injection sites are aimed at the shallowest possible levels, 1 kilometer or so. Are the in situ stresses really enough to support significant seismic events?
Well, most CCS is deeper than 1 kilometer because the CO2 has to be supercritical, and you need to, but between 1 and 2 kilometers is probably the sweet spot. You don't want to go too deep or everything's more expensive. The pressures are higher, et cetera. That's a detail. I think the point is if things are happening like are happening in the Delaware Basin, which is probably a good example of what you're talking about in this shallow, with the shallow seismicity both Peter and I spoke about, the earthquakes are likely to be relatively small. But I would argue that if that was a populated area and people were feeling these magnitude 2.5 and 3 earthquakes, there'd be a lot of pushback. And they'd say, well, how do you know those earthquakes aren't threatening the seal? Blah, blah, blah. And so that's kind of what I'm talking about. I don't think the earthquakes from these depth limited sources are going to be very big. Okay, so I agree with what Peter was saying. I agree with the tenor of your question, but I think they might be big enough to actually cause public concern. And if we lose public support, you never get it back. And so that's what I meant by sort of one change I would make in our 2012 paper. If I were rewriting it today, I would emphasize this social acceptance part of the story.
Thank you, Mark. Peter or Jens, anything to add there before we move on to the next question?
Nope, I think move on.
Okay. The next one is asks, is there a risk that having triggered failure on some faults that you produce a runaway effect? Or once injection is terminated, does that cause the seismicity to shut down more or less permanently?
Well, I think I can start that. I think Mark, I may want to say some words about Oklahoma, but the Fort Worth Basin is very instructive in that case, where the causative agent of injection into the strata above basement, that rate peaked in 2012, and then the earthquake rate peaked in 2015 and 16, and then with the rate of injection coming down, gradually the earthquake rate has tapered off as well. And now the system, it hasn't had a felt event in a couple of years. And so it's responded quite linearly. I think, Mark and his research group have quantified that to a greater degree for sure in Oklahoma.
Yeah, the pressure persists for a while. That's important to recognize. But you can quantify this with different kinds of models. Our model for Oklahoma suggested that the 40% reduction of injection mandated by the Corporation Commission in 2016 is working well, in the sense that the overall rate of earthquakes is declining very rapidly, pretty much in a way as predicted by our model. But the earthquakes, are still going to be significantly elevated from the pre-injection levels, and it's going to take a long time for them to recover. And that's the long-term story. The short-term story, when you shut a well off, okay, you're not injecting, you're not changing the pressure near the wellbore, but the pressure away from the wellbore is still elevated due to the past injection. And so just because you stop pumping doesn't mean the problem stops. Peter talked about the regional spread of the seismicity, and that happens even at a more local scale. So, just because you stop pumping doesn't mean everything should shut down immediately. The pore pressure has to dissipate back to initial levels for the system to fully shut down over time.
I'll just make a minor comment about that if you look at the case of Basel that I mentioned, the main event, the largest event, happened shortly after shut-in, and for the reason Mark mentioned, that pore pressure was still migrating, and seismicity tapered, but it went up again a few years later, and they had to reopen the well in 2017. So, it's not necessarily over.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jens. Got a couple more questions here. This one is for Peter. Was the initial pore pressure gradient in the DMG and Ellenberger basement the same? So the lower increase of pore pressure in the shallow level is not related to a higher initial pore pressure?
The Delaware Mountain Group model that I showed, that hydrogeologic model was started computationally in the 1980s, and it accounts for the depletion and production of hydrocarbons and water over time, plus the SWD that happened. So the lower pore pressure there, so that's where the pore pressure map comes from. Then you're also looking at the deep pore pressure map that I showed for the Northern Delaware Basin. And I'll point out that that map is a preliminary one and is being redone now. And we're including more of the geologic heterogeneity and anisotropy in those injection intervals this time. So I think what we'll see when that model is ready at the end of this calendar year and published is those pore pressure magnitudes for the deep strata will no longer be that much higher than they are for the shallow. I suspect at this point that they'll be equivalent. I just say both the models are pretty comprehensive. They have very long run and equilibration times, and they take into account all of the ins and the outs imparted to those systems.
Thanks, Peter. We have another question here from Bob Krantz. So do you guys have any thoughts on what stress regimes might be more or less favorable for stability or containment?
Well, Bob, no, I don't think it matters, frankly. I think that the brittle rocks are in frictional equilibrium in many areas, regardless of whether it's normal strike slip or reverse faulting. We've seen plenty of seismicity in the in the Alberta Basin of Canada, which is a sort of a strike slip regime, kind of a compressive strike slip. The deeper earthquakes are more reverse. We've seen, the Midland is a normal faulting strike slip regime. Delaware is a normal faulting regime. Marcellus is generally, fairly compressive strike slip to reverse faulting. So it's the way the crust works. The brittle rocks are in a state of failure equilibrium in all different stress states.
So maybe I might add something to that.
Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, so Bob, your question is about containment, maybe not earthquake stability. If it's about containment, then of course the whole system would matter. If you have a thrust fault at depth that is reactivating, but there's some kind of a seal rock above that is more ductile and is not faulted, then maybe containment would be dependent on the local specifics of that system. If one were thinking about like this Culberson-Mentone earthquake zone where we've got faults in the basement that go to very shallow levels and they're very steeply dipping, you could have loss of containment up to shallow levels very quickly, just as a function of the fault architecture. So, I know you know this. It just comes down to the details of what the fault architecture is and the sealing strata and how those two are related.
Thanks, Peter. There's maybe a related question or question along with that. So instead of kind of looking at it from the lens of the stress regimes, how about the mechanical properties of the fault rocks and how that would influence slip potential? There's a specific question here is about the Delaware Mountain Group versus basement faults, but I feel like we can generalize that to fault strength in general.
Let me, some of the points Jens made had a punchline, which he didn't actually say, but he was implying, and that is, an awful lot of what we've done in the past decade has shown that the Coulomb failure condition works pretty darn well. And it's not perfect. Coefficients of friction vary, of course, but when faults are critically stressed, that means they're active in a geologic context. What does that mean? It means they move a few hundred years if you live on top of the San Andreas Fault, a few thousand years if you live in the Great Basin, and a few tens or hundreds of thousands of years in the middle of the North American Plate. But they still move. And, and that limits this kinds of evolution of fault zone materials that we see in much older faults that have been subject to, long-term processes that lead to cohesion and other changes. So, we need a screening criterion, and that's what FSP is. We're not predicting earthquakes. We're not even saying how big the earthquakes are likely to be. We're trying to say if we can identify faults that are potentially problematic, we should avoid them and try to quantify that a bit in terms of either the probability of slip at a certain pressure change or for an anticipated, if you're very specific, to predict that pressure change in the deterministic mode. So if we did that, it would help a lot. As scientists, it doesn't solve the problem to our satisfaction, but I think from a regulatory and operational perspective, it provides a framework for what we need to do. And in order to, limit the problems we can limit, okay? And so it would be a big step forward if we routinely analyzed fault slip potential and avoided injection near potentially problematic faults. It's not fully satisfactory. It's not consistent with everything we know about the details of fault mechanics and earthquake physics, but it's a big step in the right direction. So I think that's its value, and that's how the kind of work the three of us talked about, I think, should be perceived.
Thank you, Mark. And we're over time, but I do want to wrap it up with one last question, which is, you touched on that a little bit there, Mark, in terms of the regulatory side of it. And, we have representation from your leadership with SCITS and Peter's leadership with TextNet Scissor, and of course from the USGS, with Jens' representation there. What advice would you give to regulatory entities regarding improvements they can make and requirements they can have that would be implemented in order to enable better regulation and reduce risk associated with injection with respect to both induced seismicity from produced water disposal or from CO2 sequestration?
Let me give a very short answer and then turn it over to Peter. In Oklahoma, the key was to do the work that demonstrated to the regulatory authority that the problem was driven by saltwater disposal. And in order to, get the problem under control, the amount of saltwater disposal had to be dramatically reduced. They got it, they did it, and the system is returning to normal. Now, of course, they have earthquakes associated with hydraulic fracturing now in the scoop and stack and all the rest, and that's a different kettle of fish. But Peter is actively involved, in dealing with regulatory agencies associated with all the Permian Basin seismicity. So why don't I let him give you a more temporarily relevant answer?
Well, I'm glad you said what you said in Oklahoma, Mark. The way I would answer that question is proposing that regulators move towards requiring the best possible characterization data available. In Texas, it's maybe a cynical comment, but it's kind of like No Child Left Behind, which, if you'll remember, originated with our Texas governor way back when. What that means is if you're an integrated major operator planning saltwater disposal wells, you'll use all of that capital at your disposal. Good data to plan it and conduct it. If you're a small operator that's not very well capitalized, you might not use much subsurface characterization data at all. But the regulator doesn't really discriminate between those two because they want all of the economic interests to be able to be competitive. And that means that undercapitalized operators don't bring the best characterization data to bear. And therefore, we're really not doing all of the diligence that can be done. So my recommendation is that we move to a framework where we start to focus on the veracity of the data that is used to characterize the subsurface. And not having the data should be not really an excuse.
Just make a couple, a general comment too, that after the characterization process, and I'm not speaking for the USGS, by the way, but just from observations that having good microseismic monitoring and a good framework for modeling the risk and understanding how it's evolving as you're observing seismicity is a very promising approach for managing the developing risk.
Thank you, Jens. Thank you, Mark and Peter. We're over time here. We have a lot more questions, but what I might do is I might just circulate those to you and see if you have any general comments or feedback to have, and then I can share them back with those who asked the questions. But I do want to thank all three of you and for the time that you've spent walking us through some of the thoughts and ideas and implications that you've shown us with induced seismicity and its applications with underground storage and disposal. Again, it's a big shout out to you. Thank you for your time and expertise here and for really leading this discussion. And with that, what I want to do is also thank folks who have helped us put the meeting together on the AAPG side and also on the PSGD side. And with that, if you have any questions or comments, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. I'll type my email address in the chat box, or you can reach me on LinkedIn. With that, we want to conclude the meeting. Thank you all, and I hope you enjoyed it, and have a great rest of your day and your weekend.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.